This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Festival.
A lot of people who were around at the time wrote about this phenomenon in their memoirs. At the turn of the century, there were articles in historical society journals. People were fascinated by who these women married. They became part of the whole origin story of the Puget Sound region.
Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Sarah Bernard.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today we're talking about the so-called Mercer girls, or a group of women brought to pioneer Seattle in a strange scheme to offer, quote, marriageable brides to the white settlers. But this whole story also lives in a much broader context of patriarchy, racism, and exploitation in the region, which only started to take a turn decades later. So that is the topic of the video, which you really should watch. If you haven't already seen it, we suggest you stop right now, go to the show notes or the show page on crosscut.com and check it out. We'll see you back here in a bit.
What kind of men are you? Where are you taking us? Where is Seattle anyway?
Washington Territory.
In the 1960s, there was a TV show called Here Come the Brides, about a bunch of plucky gals in calico dresses who came out to civilize the loggers of a fictional version of pioneer Seattle.
I guess I just wanted to start this conversation too, just sort of from the very ignorant place that I come from, which is, I had not heard about the Mercer girls. Do most people know the story of the Mercer girls? And if so, or if some people know this story, are familiar on some level with this story, where do they know it from? Is it that 1968 show, or is it another kind of local cultural narrative that people know about?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between, if you grew up here as a kid and learned local history when you were in the fifth grade or whatever, you probably have some idea of who the Mercer girls were. Mm-hmm. If you're from out of the area and you say, Here Come the Brides, or the story that the Here Come the Brides TV show was based on, a lot more people know. Oh, yeah, a whole bunch of white women came out to Seattle. They married the loggers. Wasn't that a musical? Wasn't that people have this, the TV show, Bobby Sherman was a star, David Soul. There are other cultural icons that kind of came out that gave this whole thing this kind of bright, chipper story. Mm-hmm. Seven Brides for Seven Brothers had a similar theme. Mm-hmm. I learned about the basics when I was in grade school. And then I went to Asa Mercer Junior High. Oh. So I went to, it's now middle school on Beacon Hill, but I went there, when I went there, it was a junior high school, and it was only opened in the late 1950s. 100 years after the Mercer Girl experience, somebody thought it was a good idea to name a Seattle school after the guy who instigated this adventure of human trafficking, basically.
Yeah.
Or whether mail order brides on kind of a large scale. Mm-hmm. But I don't think people know. They think of it as kind of a bright, happy story with this kind of little titillating element of these women coming out to marry guys that they didn't know, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. and becoming part of the frontier life. That's pretty much what people know. As you can imagine, there's a lot more to to the story about, well, why did they bring white women out? And mm-hmm. what problem were they trying to solve?
And in the Mercer girls as a phrase, do you know where that comes from? Why girls?
I think it's just, an old sort of, sexist term. They weren't girls. Mm-hmm. They were women. Most of them were in their 20s, 30s, even 40s. Mm. And we can go back and talk about why the women were brought out. Mm-hmm. But the process of once you make the decision that you're going to do this, and then you go back east to try and recruit women to come out, Seattle at that time was nothing. Mm-hmm. We're talking about, this is occurring in 1864, 1865. Civil War is going on. And this young man, Asa Mercer, had, was living here in Seattle, and the idea was sort of hatched by a number of people, and he was designated to be the one that would go back and recruit the women. So it's the middle of the Civil War, and he goes to Massachusetts, where there are a lot of mills, woolen mills, cotton mills, and there are a lot of single women who are working in the war effort. And many of them are single because they're widows. Mm-hmm. And his idea is, wow, I can recruit a whole bunch of single women, spinsters, unmarrieds who are working in these mills. I can recruit what they call war orphans, which, was the daughters or wives of men who've been killed in the war, and entice them to come out to Seattle. Mm-hmm. So there's this weird kind of predatory element to it, because these are women that on the East Coast, their sort of options to be part of society have been set back. You know, are they marriageable? Maybe not anymore there, but out in the frontier, suddenly they're quite desirable. Mm-hmm. And so there was a very conscious effort to kind of emphasize war widows and orphans to create this large group of women who were going to come out to Seattle, which is a place that some of them, maybe they heard of, but it was a small frontier town with whorehouses and sawmills and not a very appealing place. It actually had a reputation at the time already as a kind of sinful place, like many frontier towns, but Seattle definitely had that reputation. It was fairly novel, so there was a lot of publicity about it. Many people thought it was a great idea. And men in Seattle, some men had paid Asa Mercer money to bring them back a wife. Mm-hmm. So it had that kind of mail order bride element, which is, I'm giving you $300, my life savings. You're going to bring me back someone to do all the chores
right.
of a frontier existence. They were recruited, with the idea that they could become school teachers or they could be seamstresses. There was a conscious effort to kind of phrase it in such a way that people would know that these were good, honest Christian women, and that they weren't being recruited here for any nefarious purpose. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a second expedition, which happened right around the time Lincoln was assassinated, the end of the war, was the more successful. He had hoped to bring hundreds of women, but it really ended up being, over the course of the two expeditions, it was really more like 40 or 50 at the most.
Yeah, so that's not that many, actually.
No, and some of them weren't marriageable, actually. I mean, in terms of people who actually paid a fare, because they had to pay their own way, although
really?
That was inconsistent. He loaned some women the money to come out, and some got a free ride, some had to pay full freight.
Huh.
So he was not very good at dealing consistently with money. It got him into a lot of trouble, and many of the men who paid money didn't get what they paid for.
Right.
He couldn't really explicitly promise a particular woman to a particular man. There was some degree of free choice there. Mm-hmm. He brought out, in some cases, families, some who were already married, and were coming out to just start a new life of some kind or whatever. So that's all by way of saying that, of that group that he brought out, not all were so-called marriageable. That was the big term. These are marriageable women. Mm-hmm. And race had a big factor to do with it, the fact that these were white women. Mm-hmm. And that had a particular value.
This event itself, which is sort of strange and problematic, but it's sort of like, where does this mail order bride type of scheme originate? It really originates in this bigger context, which you talked about in the video.
Yeah, I mean, basically the settling of the frontier was largely a male enterprise.
Yeah.
And often married or single, men would often be the first ones to come out. They might bring their family later once they got a homestead going. Or they, were unattached and working. They were prospectors, they were loggers, they were seamen, they were, all different kinds of things. And you had these huge disparity ratio of white men to white women, and the number of white women, it was maybe 10 to 1. It was, these large disparity. So what did these settlers do for sex? What did they do to have somebody as their partner in setting up a home or helping them? Well, there were several solutions that people pursued. One was so-called country marriages, which were marriages between white men and indigenous women. And the Hudson Bay Company, which was sort of the real, the first big kind of settling force in the Northwest in terms of, the trading posts and farms and schools and all that kind of thing. They had a more sort of laissez-faire attitude when it came to race. The Hudson Bay Company originating in Canada, they had lots of multiracial employees and families, and many of them had intermarried with Native women. If a trapper wanted to marry an indigenous woman, it was not encouraged particularly, but it wasn't looked down upon entirely. And it was actually seen maybe as good for business because this established helped smooth trade relationships between local tribes and the fur traders. Americans, as they moved into the Oregon country, and of course they're moving in where there's a racial exclusion law, right? So, Oregon had passed a series of laws to try and prevent people of color from living in Oregon. So they're coming out with, but the most effective thing in terms of segregation was the homestead laws, which said, you can come out and you get a certain number of acres of land that you can homestead, but it only applied to white men. And if you were married to a white woman, you could double the amount you could get.
Oh my gosh.
So a lot of the incentive was to get marriageable white women so you could increase the amount of property. But also there was a tremendous amount of racism about the mingling of whites and Native Americans. I didn't know how big a factor that was with the Mercer girls until I started reading the pioneer papers talking about the evils of intermarriage between whites and Native women. And so the arguments were made by newspaper editorialists of, we've got to bring white women to the territory because we can't have this race mixing. It's going to degrade both races. The results of this interaction is terrible. I mean, it's very blatant and unapologetic. It's just stated as this is sort of a fact of nature.
And this is writing in early Seattle papers,
Puget Sound newspapers, the Puget Sound Dispatch and others. It's being discussed at the legislature in Olympia. Intermarriage is banned in the Washington Territory. Interracial marriage is banned. There's an explicit desire for white women. And then there's a second part of this, which is frontier men, white men marrying young girls. And I put marrying in quotes, but there were laws that said the age of consent was at 16 or 18, whatever. But there are just plenty of cases, both in marriages to indigenous women, but also white girls, or should I say, indigenous girls and white girls, who are children, 12 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. And this was a practice that many people looked down on, but it still happened. This desire to, populate the territory with white people, meant that, and there was a high demand for women and girls.
Wow. The ratio of male to female is like 10-1, and there's this racism rampant, and so it just becomes like, well, okay, I guess just find this 12-year-old girl because she's female. Like, oh, it's so painful.
Yeah. And it happened, it happened very commonly. Henry Yesler married a native girl who was 15.
Wow.
So, and then he had a wife who came out, and that was also one of the factors that would happen, which was people who had married indigenous women often, the minute their real white wife showed up from back east or they found somebody new, they would dump them.
Wow. There's such a power differential in so many ways there, but if a 15-year-old girl, to me that's not consensual. That's
rape.
That's rape. Something that strikes me about those particular anecdotes, there are probably more, but Yesler, there's a road named after him. These are common names from early Seattle,
Seattle history.
Yeah.
Those are absolutely names that you hear about. They were important figures in the creation of Seattle.
Exactly. We'll be right back.
Support for the Mossback podcast comes from the Crosscut Festival, happening online and in Seattle May 4th through the 7th. Join us in celebrating bold ideas for a changing world at our biggest event of the year, featuring fireside conversations, panels, live podcast recordings, workshops, and special events that explore forward thinking in politics, social justice, the environment, history, innovation, and more. Spend your week with the community of the curious at the Crosscut Festival this spring. More information at crosscut.com/festival.
I think I know the answer to this, but in terms of the brief moment in time when there might have been, some relationships between indigenous communities and white communities, it's always the indigenous women who are kind of marrying the white men, right? It's not the other way around.
That's right. In the vast majority of cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which to me just reminds us once again that this is about power. I think one part of the video that really stuck with me, I believe it kind of starts there, is when you kind of acknowledge that in early Seattle, so I'm assuming, right after Seattle was called Seattle in the 1850s or something, it seems like there was one role for Native women, and that was to work in places like the Elahi. It just seemed like that was part of pioneer Seattle. It was like, oh yeah, right. So that we have these brothels and these are the women who work there, and that,
yeah. Seattle's first businesses are, a store, a trading post. Henry Yesler started the first sawmill, employing Native workers. The city moved very early to prevent Native people from living within the city when they created. So this is pre-Mercer girls. But one of the major attractions of the village on Elliott Bay, the white village on Elliott Bay, was bordellos. They built houses and recruited prostitutes. Well, there weren't white women to recruit, so they were filled with indigenous women, many of them from out of the area. They would recruit them from the northern tribes, and they were sex workers. And this was, commemorated in song. There's a song that we talk about in the thing where, it's these miners or whatever up in British Columbia are all excited about, getting their days off and going to Seattle and enjoying the company of Native women all night, It's true that over the course of Seattle, from the time of the Mercer girls, but even earlier, 1850s, all the way up to World War II, that vice, as we call it now, and that was prostitution, gambling, saloons, interracial mixing, whatever, those forbidden things were one of the attractions of Seattle. And in fact, the business community up until, into the early 20th century, not only participated in that business, but encouraged it and defended it legally. They worked very hard to make sure that prostitution that looked the other way. Prostitution became a major tax resource and a system of payoff to politicians, to the police, and others. So there was a financial interest there in keeping it going. Even while Seattle is growing in ways where more women are here and it's becoming more middle class, it's sort of like, well, it's a big industry. We don't want to scare it out of town. And everybody's, palms are being greased to kind of say, oh, yes, well, prostitution's terrible. But, your bank account is full of cash that came from looking the other way and making sure they actually didn't get closed down.
Huh. Yeah. So that was a big part of the sort of reputation of early Seattle, and then just kind of sounds like it got pretty entrenched into the governance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the gold rush probably really cemented it for a while, because there were all these people coming from out of town, dropping tons of money in Seattle, going off to the gold fields and coming back, dropping another ton of money in Seattle. And these attractions were primary, mining the miners, as they used to call it.
I mean, that's the context. So you have, just so much going on there. Patriarchy, racism, exploitation. I mean, something that is upsetting to me, of course, are these, the reason that we're bringing these women out is because they're white and therefore they're marriageable, quote unquote, and then it would be legitimate somehow. But, heaven forbid these women are being trafficked out here because, these are respectable women, right? They would never work in the brothels. Like, oh, what a horrible thing to sort of traffic women into these brothels. But it seems like to me that narrative kind of ignores the Native women who were, I imagine most of them trafficked into these brothels. It just seems to say these women who are not white, it's okay for them to work in the brothels, but it's definitely not okay for the white women to work. I don't know. That's just something that really bothers me.
Yeah, it's a contemporary story in that the wounds and legacy of that dynamic continue to this day with missing Indigenous women. What's happening to them? Who is exploiting them?
Yeah.
And kind of a footnote was just recently there was a protest that happens on an annual basis and has been going on up in Vancouver for, over 20 years, maybe 30 years even, which is a march in support of Indigenous women who are missing and exploited. And they recently toppled a statue in Gastown, which is kind of Vancouver's Pioneer Square, the historic Gastown, of a guy named John Gassy Jack Dayton, who's actually the namesake of Gastown.
I see.
It was named after him. He was a saloon owner. And but the reason they toppled the statue is he married two First Nations women, one of whom was a child, 12 years old, and her name was Quahalia. She's from the First Nations of the Squamish, not Suquamish, but the Squamish people. And, the statue was put up in the 1970s as like, oh, here's this old character from, he ran a saloon. They called him Gassy because he talked too much. But Gassy Jack was vandalized, and finally the statue, they've been splashing red paint on it for a long time. But this is exactly what happened here in Seattle in terms of, marrying Indigenous children and women. And that part of the story just getting written out. What's he known for? Oh, he was a chatty saloon keeper, and let's put a statue up and promote the bars in Gastown.
Exactly. Right.
I mean, that's what we do with this stuff. But it's a contemporary story in multiple ways. But this is one that just because it's recently been in the news, it's like Indigenous people haven't forgotten. this legacy.
Exactly.
It's the rest of us that have blotted it out or papered it over or just never been told.
I mean, quote unquote, married a 12-year-old girl. I mean, that's a crime. That's a crime, and that
and you know what? It was a crime then.
And it was a crime then.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Right.
something to remember is the age of consent was not 12.
Right.
The age of consent was not 13. It was not 14, but these things were unenforceable. These communities, unenforceable in the sense that people look the other way, unenforceable in the sense that they happened often out of public view. People might even have been stigmatized, but a lot of it was just sort of mainstreamed. I think white men were kind of looked down upon for doing it, but I think it was more of a kind of social ostracism, mostly of the victim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mostly the victim. I just think one of the interesting things is that the story of the so-called Mercer girls is presented as a kind of feel-good, humorous story.
Yeah.
And you can pick it apart with all this dark stuff, but you can also pick it apart in terms of did it really have an impact? It was only a handful of women. It was only, in terms of who came out and got married, it couldn't have been more than 30. The idea that this was some kind of turning point in the pioneer phase doesn't really hold up. So it really becomes a kind of story that's meant to, in a sense, titillate at one level, but then also immediately serve this greater narrative of how the West was won.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by Seth Halloran, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. Cover art by Greg Cohen. And many thanks to engineer Rusty Bacall for building out an amazing COVID-friendly audio studio. If you'd like to check out more videos from the 5 seasons of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please review us. It really helps other people find us. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to KCTS9's on-demand programming and a subscription to the Mossback Den newsletter, where Knute shares even more Pacific Northwest history. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Sarah Bernard, and that's it for this season. Stay tuned for the next one, and thanks so much for listening.